I remember in rabbinical school, I had a couple of different teachers that I thought gave really great sermons, and I looked to for advice often in how they delivered theirs. And they had very different styles. One of them each week wouldn't prepare a full written out sermon, but throughout the Torah reading and between aliyot, they would give a little bit of a drosh and a discussion that would add up together towards one full idea that he wanted to talk about that week, and it was very interactive and participatory. And then I had another teacher that insisted Torah discussions are what lazy rabbis do that don't want to write a sermon. And the other teacher insisted that the discussion was actually harder because he never knew where it was going to go. He had to think on his feet. He had to prepare in advance not just one sermon, but a myriad of possibilities in case the discussion brought it from not what he wanted to talk about, but to something else that was also in the portion and also important. And he insisted that that was much more difficult, and writing and reading a sermon was what lazy rabbis did. So that said, today we're going to do a Torah discussion, and I'm going to let you decide what the reasoning for that is. But I knew today we'd have a smaller group with the long weekend as we're getting ready for the holidays. I wanted to give this a try. So it will help a lot in our process if we really are participatory, if people want to join in and throw out some ideas. And then afterwards, you can let me know if you liked it or not, or if you think it's because I'm lazy or not, or if this was more work. You can decide. But there's an interesting idea in our Torah portion this week. It says, "V'chavta et ha'avonim et kol divrei ha'Torah hazot." The Israelites are commanded by God when they cross into the land of Israel, right when they get across the Jordan River, that they're supposed to put up these stones. And on these stones, they're supposed to write, Kol divrei haTorah hazot, all the words of this Torah. All of the words of this Torah should be written on these stones. So there's a few different questions of what was actually written on these stones. One rabbi, Rabbi Sachs, who was a Persian rabbi in the 9th century, so in the late 9th, early 10th century, he says that it was the 613 commandments. Most of the rabbis take this approach. They say they'd have to be really big stones to fit the entire Torah, so these stones just have the 613 commandments. A Spanish rabbi, the Abarbanel, later says that actually it was just the 10 commandments, just like at Mount Sinai, the 10 commandments were what the Israelites wrote on these stones. Another rabbi, the Ralbag, Rabbi Levi ben Gershon, he suggests that it was actually just the blessings and curses that came up in our Torah portion. And meanwhile, the Ramban, he says that it was the entire Torah. They were really big stones or a miracle, he says. It was one or the other. And a modern rabbi, David Zvi Hoffman, says it doesn't have to be really giant, or it doesn't have to be a miracle. Think of Hammurabi's code, written on these giant stones. It's a very long text. We would just need more than one, but on a few of them, we really could have written the entire Torah. So there are all these different answers of what was written on those stones. My question to you is, what would you have written on them? If you had to pick a lesson, a teaching, a message in the Torah, a story that you would say is the most important, this is what I would have written on them. I would have wanted all the Israelites to see as they marched into Israel and everyone who entered the land to know that this is a teaching in the Torah. What teaching would that be? This is the participation part. What do you think is an important story or an important lesson or a message of the Torah? Please. Beautiful. Micah's message to be kind to others and walk humbly before God. It's interesting. You picked a verse from the prophets, not even a verse from the 5 books, right? The idea of the Chumash, the traditional, the first 5 books of the Torah, but a book from the later prophets. It's a beautiful and incredible verse. It's the verse, right, we have inscribed right up here. What does God want from you? Right? God wants you to do justice, to love righteousness, and to walk humbly with your Lord. It's a beautiful verse. It's one of my favorites. What else? What's another verse, right? We can expand it to all of Tanakh, a story, a lesson, a verse, a teaching. What would you inscribe? Or do you agree with one of these commentators? Is it the commandments, the blessings, the curses? Everything which deals with tikkun olam, right? All of the ethical mitzvot, all of the moral obligations that we have, the obligations to repair the world. Beautiful. It's a wonderful answer. Anyone else have any thoughts? Please. These giant stones, yeah. It's true. It's hard for me to imagine too. So that's great, right? The 10 Commandments. And even those, as we often have them, right? We don't have one set here, but they're often abbreviated, right? We see them written out, not even fully written out, but just a few words of each of them when we see it carved out today. So all the more so if someone carving the entire Torah, it seems like a very drastic undertaking. But the 10 Commandments, that's an important part of the Torah. Anyone else have anything? Please. Everything. The whole thing. You can't pick a part that's more important or less important, right? It's all equally important. Beautiful. There's a few different ideas. Oh, please, Chazan. Elaborate? Right. Beautiful, right? Beautiful. So the mitzvah to choose life. And the rabbis later apply that to a situation, as the Chazan mentioned. If you have a choice between going to a wedding or a funeral, they say go to the wedding. That we should be celebrating life in these joyous occasions in the future, and that for you is an essential message of Judaism, to choose life, to celebrate, to enjoy it. So these are wonderful ideas. I promise there'll be more discussion. There's a lot that we could pick to be on those tablets, to be on those stones. There's a lot of lessons and messages we could think of as the essential parts of the Torah to Judaism. But I want to think more broadly, and I have another question, which is, what was the purpose of these stones? Why were they there? And before we address that, I have a question for you, which is, what is it you love about being Jewish? If you had to pick something, whether it's a holiday or a teaching, a ritual, the food, or something else, what is it to you that's the essential part of being Jewish? Please. The traditions. So it's the tradition, celebrating the holidays, but it's the celebrating them with people. The family, the community, that aspect is something that's essential from Judaism. The relationships and the connections we get from living these mitzvot, these commandments. Beautiful. Anyone else? What's something essential to them about being Jewish? Sorry? Language. The oldest language in the world, Hebrew, Ivrit. Beautiful. I won't ask people to raise their hands if they don't speak Hebrew, right? But it's interesting that for you that's an essential part, but there's a large part of our modern Jewish world whose Hebrew, right, is more or less absent, right? It's a difficult journey for them. Right? Hebrew's always been my personal struggle as I took it only post-university in a real fashion. Please. Connections to each other. Beautiful. So the relationships, the joining together. Anyone else have thoughts? Please. Beautiful. Or you can walk into any synagogue in the world and you know what's happening. You feel a connection. You have something shared experience and you can connect with them. It's a beautiful idea. It's interesting to me that a lot of what people's essential parts of Judaism has been focused on the relationships, connection, community, yet a lot of the verses that we've inscribed weren't verses about community or connection. Anyone else have anything for them that's the essential part? Would anyone say it's a mitzvah? There's a ritual practice that to them is an essential part of their Jewish identity or their Jewish life? The Torah is a roadmap. Jewish wisdom is a guide for how we should live. It's interesting. Right? What is the purpose of the Torah? of mitzvot, of Judaism? What is it that we're supposed to take away from it? Because that, I think, is the more interesting question that the rabbis ask and debate. Not what was written on these stones as they entered the land of Israel, but why did they write them there? And the Torah offers something. Right when God commands them to put these stones, it says, so that you may enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, a land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, promised you. Put these stones up, write the Torah on it, so that you may enter the land. But there are a couple different interpretations of that. What does that really mean? So the Ramban says that in his opinion, it's an end in and of itself. You should write the Torah on these stones so that you may go into the land. Right? The Torah will allow you to enter the land. By observing this commandment, you will be able to go and do this thing that you want to do. It's an end in and of itself. But then he goes on, even though he says, in my opinion, it's this, he says, or maybe it means you should write upon the stones all the words of the Torah so that they serve as a remembrance to you once you go into the land and conquer it. It's for something else. It's not to allow them to get into the land, it's for their life after they're in, how they live. The Torah, their mitzvot, isn't about just doing them so X happens, but by living them, knowing them, remembering them, X happens. You create a society that's just. You live a life of meaning and connection with family and friends. You have a sense of connection with Jews and people around the world, of community. You're a part of something larger. You remember ancient traditions. You're connected to a language. It's interesting to me the Ramban has two answers to his own question. Why should they do this? They should do it because they're supposed to do it. It's an end in and of itself. This is what you have to do. God commanded it. Or they do it because it'll allow everything else that they want in life to happen by remembering those words. That, as the Chazan said, the Torah is a guidepost. Right? It's a way of living our life. The wisdom it passes down to us. It's a guide for how we should live. In the end, my takeaway from all of this is that it's fascinating that there isn't a clear answer, I don't think. I just gave you two answers from one rabbi, and if we looked in a book of traditional commentary, all the rabbis and all the generations have a lot of different answers and opinions on this. Why do they write these stones? Why do they write the Torah down on it? What is their purpose? It's interesting. But I think there's something to be said for the Ramban's second answer. That mitzvot, that Torah, is more than just checking a box. That it's about a process. It's something that's supposed to change us in the way we live our lives. In our Parsha this week, after they give their tithes and they give a portion of the tithes and their fruit to the poor, they're supposed to say something about, we're giving this because you commanded it, and we remember that. And the rabbis ask, why do they have to say something so redundant? They're saying the words. Why do they have to say they remember it? Clearly, by saying the words God commanded, they're remembering the commandment. And the answer to that the rabbis give is that sometimes we do things by rote. And it's there to remind us that we shouldn't just say those words absent-mindedly and do the acts absent-mindedly, but we have to do them with intention. We have to remember what they're there for. So as we prepare ourselves for the year to come, my thought, my lesson, at least it's resonating with me this week, that I'm going to try to take and incorporate in my own life, is thinking about the parts of the Torah, whether it's a verse or the whole thing, the rituals, the essence to me of what it means to be Jewish, thinking about how I can do that in a way that impacts me. How maybe this past year I did some things just rote, without thinking. How this year to come, I can do it with more intention. I can live my life with more intention, my Judaism with more intention. And in doing so, maybe connect to that wisdom a bit more, so that I may live the life that I want to lead in 57, 84. Shabbat Shalom.